Now, next year marks a century since the start of the First World War, a war which resulted in a devastating loss of life and also brought major social and economic changes. Now, this summer on BBC Midlands Today, we'll be looking at life in the lead-up to the Great War, which transformed many women's lives.
Yes, as Liz Copper reports, in 1913, the potteries had a large female workforce, and many of them were beginning to demand greater freedom and, importantly, the right to vote.
It's an image from 1913 that a century on is still shocking. Suffragette Emily Davison dies after falling beneath the feet of the King's horse at the Derby. A fatality in the fight for women's votes. This on the eve of a conflict that would shape so many women's lives. One of the most famous autobiographies of the First World War is Testament of Youth, written by Vera Brittain. Vera Brittain was born here in Newcastle-under-Lyme. She was the daughter of a Staffordshire businessman. And in the opening pages of Testament of Youth, she describes remembering seeing, at a very early age, alarming glimpses through a train window of the pot bank furnaces flaming angrily against a black winter sky. But her safe, comfortable upbringing and the social certainties of the day were about to be shattered. Baroness Shirley Williams is Vera Brittain's daughter. Her mother's life in 1913 bore no hint of the horror of the war she was to witness.
For this particular group, which Testament of Youth, my mother's book, starts from and is a great deal about in the early chapters, it wasn't a bad life. And I think it's worth saying that the First World War shattered that.
While some women were fighting quietly for education, others were on the march.
1913 is an interesting year because you're starting to feel that things are not quite as they've always been. There's a sense of sort of disturbance, a sense that things are perhaps changing. And that relates to women, it relates to working class people in terms of trade unions, and it relates to issues like Ireland. And Irish politics matter not just in Ireland but throughout the country.
In 1913, this was a pilgrimage organised by the non-violent suffragists. Its route took the campaigners for women's votes from the north of England to London. One of the biggest rallies in the Midlands was in Stoke-on-Trent. It was here, right in the middle of Hanley, where 10,000 demonstrators and spectators gathered. In fact, the crowds were so large, overflow meetings were hastily arranged in nearby squares. Keele University student Toby Gavin has unearthed details of this little researched piece of pottery's history.
There was a lot of banners and 60 women marching down the street. There would be bands coming with them as well. It's a spectacle. People just came to see it, but certainly in the evening, the potters were a lot more ready to engage, and they were a lot more ready to kind of question the women's motives, what they were doing there.
The crowds in Hanley were addressed by the city's first Lord Mayor, Cecil Wedgwood, and his wife Lucy. At the Wedgwood Museum, pictures from 1913 show the pottery where Lucy Wedgwood exerted considerable influence.
She was very involved in the welfare of women, actually, in the potteries area. She founded the infant welfare clinics, which are much more than they sounded. They were involved with family planning as well as giving children clothes and making sure they had milk and food and so forth.
It wasn't just working conditions and welfare that were changing. This was a period where opportunities opened up for women.
One of the few good products of the First World War, there were not many, was that women got accelerated, precipitated into the sorts of jobs they would never have had before. They drove ambulances, they became, like my mother, nurses, but also they became doctors.
The struggles of 1913 were to foreshadow an era defined by war. An era which would leave women's lives so completely changed. Liz Copper, BBC Midlands Today.
Gosh, fascinating pictures, aren't they? Now, not many sports